Good morning, students. So today we'll be looking at the practical aspect of application security. So we'll be implementing security on our application. We'll go through it like as prescribed by the theoretical aspect of it that we did in our last session. So just a reminder of what we did in our last session, we talked about application security and what it means. We clearly now understand client-side security model, enterprise application, and given a description of an enterprise application, we should be able to ascertain the different types of security policies in our application and how to implement those security policies using security features and security technology. We should also be able to identify threats and the rest of them. So we talked about authorization and authentication, data integrity and data privacy, non-repudiation and quality of service, and auditing as the major characteristics of application security. We talked about users, groups, and roles in a security policy. And we explained all those terms, and we talked about security tools like SSL and MD5 and encryption, all the stuff. We also talked about security attributes and how credentials are part of security attributes in a security policy. Now we're going to see how we're going to implement security based on the application we're working on. And since we're working on, we're using a Maven application and we're using the Spring framework, let's go see how we can use Spring to implement security on our application. Now we go to our POM files. So far we have these dependencies: the Spring Boot Starter Web, Spring Boot Starter Test for testing, the JPA, Spring Boot Starter JPA for user connectivity to the backend, and the backend is MySQL. By backend, I mean your data store. Backend is MySQL. So the first step in we're going to be using Spring Boot security model here, and that will implement the basic authentication. So let's assume that we have a security model that says all our endpoints as declared in the controller. All our endpoints should be secure. So the first step is Spring Boot has given us the ability to attach. Spring Boot already has something called Spring Boot Security Auto Configuration, and the way to use that in our application is to include the dependency. So let's do that. The dependency, as usual, is called Spring Boot Starter Security. So adding the dependency, artifact ID is Spring Boot Starter Security, and it's from the group ID of the Spring Framework boot. So when we do this, and Maven automatically downloads it. If it doesn't, you can refresh or load Maven on that small pop-up that comes up there. You would see something happening beneath here. You'd see resolving dependencies. When that happens, you already have all the modalities of Spring Boot security in your application. You can verify by checking the external, and then somewhere in here you would see something as relates to security. There's 1, 2, 3. It wasn't there before. If you check your application, you'd see it wasn't there before. So now we have included Spring Boot security. But before that, let me take it out again and refresh. Just to verify, I don't think we'd have any security stuff in here. No security stuff. So I'm going to run this application. This is the application I've been working with you all this while. So when I run it, it does whatever it does in the background and shows the log in the console. So if you follow the logs, you'd see all these steps Spring Boot takes to actually build and run your application. Based on all the things you've activated, like JPA and all the rest of them, you'll see. So it took 11 seconds for my application to run. And to test this, let's use the we have created a test class for testing our controller. So what we're trying to do in this place, when we're building this application, we started in stages. We started with the entities and the factories, and then we created tests for factories. Now the factory is specific to one and only one thing. It just generates or it creates instance of your entities or value object or what have you. That's a step. The next step is the repository, which handles your creation and modification of entities and value objects, and we have test cases for that. And we have services that exposes the repository and then also contains business logic, and you should also have test cases for that. So when you're done with this, now you want to expose your application to the world in the form of a web service, a microservice, and then we introduce the controller layer. So the controller layer is now exposing everything that we have, including the creation and modification of objects and our business logic if we have any. So this is what we're going to be testing in the controller layer. So this is testing the controller layer, which depends on all the layers that we've built. So when we're talking about securing a web application, web service, we're talking about securing the endpoint. These are the endpoints. So when you have something like localhost, the port number, then /race and /create, that's an endpoint that calls to this create method. So we're trying to secure this so that not everybody will be able to create role. It will not be accessible to everyone. So that's the security policy there. So that means you have a role and you have users. And when you have a role, that role dictates that a particular role is able to create or call this endpoint successfully. And then you attach that role to a user. When that user calls this particular endpoint, you have to authenticate that user and then check whether that user is authorized to access this role. So that's what we're going to try to do now. Testing this from this, we can see everyone can call it. I can call this from anywhere. I can call it from my Postman. And let's see that the database is actually there. The database is called tpayroll. We're looking at the race object, so let's go check the database. So we're looking at the race, so let's select all from race. There's one in there already. So let's try to call. Let's try to call that. I think it's. Let me verify the endpoint. So it's raise and create. And this should take a raise body that has description. So let's go build that. So when you call this, is successful, you can verify. We can see that we have that. So anyone can call this if you have access to this endpoint. If you have access to this endpoint, you can call this. So I'm going to stop the application, and then I'll now introduce Spring Boot security. Why not here in the POM file? It's going to add the dependency, Spring Boot security, and then you reload your Maven. So like I said, when you add this dependency, you already have all the functionalities of Spring Boot security in your application. So let's see how that works. I'm going to start the application again. I'll run it. Now pay attention to the console window. You can see we have something here. It outputted this line using generated security password, and it outputted this. And then it created some filter chains, and that's the way Spring Boot security works. It has so many filters before a servlet that is going to secure. So what this means is, in the background, Spring Boot has created a user and generated a password for it. So the default user is normally called, the default username is normally user, as in USER. The generated password is this. So anytime you start and stop this application, it generates another password for you. Let's see how that works. Let's go back here and try to call this. Let's try to create another race. We can see a 401 here. If you can see my mouse, it says 401. And 401 means unauthorized. So it means that this particular endpoint is now secure and has to, before you access this, you have to be authorized, meaning you have to have a particular role before you can access this. So this is the way Spring Boot works, and to test that, you can go to your authentication layer on Spring Security on Postman, and you would select the basic authentication, because that's what we implemented. Let's use user and put in just PASSWORD. So let's try this. It says unauthorized. Let's try root. It says unauthorized. So when you use the right username and password, let me copy the password from there. Let's see what happens here. It says unauthorized. Now you would have this you would have this kind of error because you do not, there's a difference between the create, which is a post method, and the get. So let's call the get method and pass all. We're trying to get all with no security. It still says unauthorized. Now this is with no security. It says unauthorized. This particular stuff is not unauthorized. Let's try that with this, with security. And we see we can now get all the stuff in there. Let's try with a different password. Now, this is what happens. Whatever you're using to access the endpoint, as soon as it has been authorized in the first instance, remember it says Spring Boot creates a particular session for a particular user. It says Postman as a kind of user that is trying to access this. So once this particular client has been authorized in the first place, it doesn't matter when you're coming back again in the same session, it already knows you're authorized. That's why with anything here, you can now access it because you've been authorized in the first place. Let's see what happens if you take out the authentication. Still goes through because you've been authorized in the first place. So this is a client that is trying to access this particular endpoint, and Spring Boot has created a session, and in that session it has been authorized. So one way to enforce that is, I think you have to close this and start it again to kill that session. Either that or you start the application again. So let's try that. We've killed that session of Postman. Starting another Postman session. Sometimes it gives unpredictable results. So yeah, it's okay. No, this is not. This is a different thing. So let's try calling this. It says unauthorized. I'm calling this without the wrong password. It says unauthorized. So it's coming with a new session. Now this is a new session that it's trying to access that endpoint with. That's why it says unauthorized. As soon as you put in the right password for that particular session, you can have access to it. Now that's for the get. Now in some instances, the post would never work, even though you give the right password. Because post is a different kind of HTTP method that has to do with it believes you're trying to send sensitive data to the backend. So we're going to try testing this using our Spring Boot, our test case. Yeah, it says unauthorized. So let's try testing using our test case. So we'll go to the, let me take this down. So the way to test this is, remember the REST template that we already have. And remember this is an implementation of basic authentication using Spring Boot. As soon as you include the Spring Boot starter dependency for security, it gives you a default implementation of the basic authorization. The basic authorization I'm referring to is the basic authentication. So back in here, I want to test using this. So let's run this and see what happens. This has not implemented anything. By that I mean we have not implemented any basic authentication in here. So running this should return with an error. You can see it created. Let me maximize this. You can see it generated a default password, and then the creator of this will obviously fail because it doesn't have that password. It doesn't have the right to. Same thing goes for all of this. This is also telling us please sign in. You can see it requires us to put in username and password to access this because of the Spring security that we've enabled. So one thing I'm trying to say is, I'm trying to point out is, you can see that at any time you run this test case, it generates password. Let me run it again. And this is ending with 5BA and starts with C4D. Let me run this again. It generated a fresh copy. So it will be difficult to write a test case using the default implementation of Spring Boot security, because at every point in time, it generates a password for the user. Now the default user is called user. So let's just write it's called the string. I can call this security username. I told you the default is user. If you have a problem with the password, since it always generates a fresh copy, so we can have a password here. I'm going to go copy this. But I'm going to show you the basic way of implementing or trying to attach a credential to your test REST template. So this particular one, let's go to the get all. The REST template has a method called with basic authentication that allows us the username and password. So let's do that here. Username is going to be security username and security password. So what this means is you are attaching a credential, username and password that is of type basic authentication to this particular REST template. So it uses this username and password as the credentials to access the particular URL you're talking about. So if I run this again, and we attach that to the getAll method. Where's the getAll? We attach that to the read method, sorry. So let's check the read. Now it told us that the test case failed. Now it failed because it generated a new password and we have a copy of the old one. So it's going to be difficult to do this. So how do we manipulate this? First off, let me try it. Okay. I hope you're trying to follow in the picture I'm trying to paint. So this is the problem that we have. So how do we make this password? Someone's hands up. Yes, Mr. King.
Sir, I just want to ask, where does the password get generated? In which class or where exactly?
Yeah, it when you included the dependency in the POM file, you included the basic implementation of Spring Boot security. And one of those classes, it generates one of those security classes, it generates the password. Which brings me to the next, when I explain the next agenda, you would understand. So we're trying to make this table. Now, Spring Boot, our Spring framework is a configurable framework. If you remember when we were talking about JPA, we talked about the application of properties, and we said this application of properties is where you can configure stuff. So if you don't want to use the default, you can configure stuff here. So one of the things we would want to configure is security. So the key for security, according to Spring, is spring.security.user.name. And you can see in the whatever pops up, you can see the default user is user as a default username. So you can give this anything you want now. You can say, what do I give it? X. And you can configure the password. So ideally, when you restart this application, it shouldn't generate a default user and a default password anymore. Instead, it should use whatever you have declared here in your configuration file. So let's try that out. So we can't find any password generation anymore. Now it means that the user and the password has been configured and it has overridden the default configuration of Spring Boot security. So testing this, let's go back here and go to get all. Call this, it says unauthorized. Now this is with user. If I use rex and password, it gives me everything in the database. So I can go back to my test cases. I now know the username and the password. It's rex, and the password is. So let me run this. You can see it didn't generate anything. And our read was successful because it's actually passed, if you would see, it passed this stage. And this stage is where it tries to call the endpoint. And it got to this stage where it's now failing because that particular data is not in the database. So if we do a get all, you can see it's telling us enter username and password. So if I include the password, basic authentication password, username, and password, if I run this again, let's hope that the get all now works. So the get all should give us everything in the database. We can see that is working. It comes back with 200 and it gave us everything in the database. It doesn't now require us to enter username and password. So this is how to test using your test cases, how to test with basic authentication, given a particular username and password. So this is basic authentication. Any questions so far? Okay, so the problem now comes, what if I have more than one user? What happens? Before we get there, you have two choices. You can either, when working with Spring Security, you have two choices. You can either disable the auto configuration that comes with this and implement yours. That is kind of counterintuitive because if you include this and then disable something in there, then disable the auto configuration, it doesn't make sense. It's best not to use it at all. But once you use this, instead of disabling the auto configuration, you can actually extend it. It's called like surpassing it. So you use it to implement yours. And the way you're going to do that is, now going back to our problem, what happens when I have more than one user? Now Spring has also given us a way to configure more than one users. Now that has to be on the code layer, not on the configuration layer anymore. So I'm going to stop this application. I'm going to disable this, disable that. And I'm going to write a class that's going to help me configure my Spring security that is going to use, or that's going to build upon Spring Boot's auto configuration. Now, the where you put your class depends on you, but I usually put mine in a package called security. I call the class security. You can call it anything. Security config. So the first thing you need to do is you need to enable configuration. Now this tells Spring Boot that this particular class is a configuration class. It uses it for configuration purposes. And what kind of configuration is this? Now we have to specify by extending the web security configurer adapter. Now this is in this class. According to King's question, this class is responsible for configuring all the security configurations in an application. So in this class, we have default implementation of the users and the password. So this means that we extended it, meaning we want to override it and tell Spring Boot the kind of users we want and the type of password we want. Another thing you need to enable is enable web security. This makes sure that Spring uses this class for web security. So we are going to mouse over this and go and find out the methods to overload or override, sorry. So the methods to override are basically two. The configure that takes in HTTP security and the configure that takes in an authentication manager builder. These are the ones that concern us. So these two. So this configures HTTP security and this configures credentials, authentication manager builder. So first off, let's take this off because we don't need to. This means that you're trying to use the, if you call this, you're trying to use the default implementation of this method. We don't want to use that. So I'm going to start. Now this authentication is an object of this. And I'm going to start by implementing an in-memory implementation. It's not tied to any form of data store. It's in the memory of this application. Then I'll call the with user and pass the username. Let's pass a username. Weird. And then I'll say with password 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then I have the ability also to attach roles. So I can give roles here. Let's say this guy is an admin. And then you can stop here. So what this does is you're saying that your authentication builder is of type in memory. It stores the user and the credentials and the roles. And you've said the username is that, and the password is that, and this guy has this particular role. You can now add more than one by saying dot and with user client with password 54321, and you give this guy a role, and he is a user. So this is a way to add more than one user. So you can repeat this block for as many users that you want. In this case, the new thing we're introducing is role. So we see that we have a role called admin and user. And usually, admin is higher than that. And this can take a list. So, and in the right sense of it, an admin can do what a user can do, but a user can't do what an admin can do. So in this case, you might as well just add user here. So this particular user called with the username weird has admin role and user role. And this client, which is a user, has user role. That's how to use this configure. So this is used in building credentials and roles and what have you. So in this case, in this particular method, we're going to try to define a particular endpoint for each of these roles and who has access to them. So you start with saying HTTP, and we're using the HTTP basic authentication and authorize request. What this means is you're using over HTTP, the kind of authentication you're using is the basic. This is just a form of conjunction of building series of configurable stuff on your HTTP. I'm saying authorize all requests. Then I need to specify the request that this particular user can use and the request that this one has access to. And you do that using the ANT matcher. ANT matcher takes in a series of string pattern, or takes a method and a string pattern. So let's use the first one, method and string pattern. So we're saying for all HTTP host, in this pattern, create. Well, let me start it with, I think it's this. Create. Then you can attach a particular role to it. Admin. What this means is any particular method, any particular URL that has the post method and has create in the endpoint, this is a wildcard, so anything can start it and then create. It's only the user with the admin role that has access to that. That's what this means. So this is where you can build. You can now say, continue by saying, and let's say, okay, let's say the read. Sorry, get. read and anything has row user. So this means that the user, any particular user with this row user, will be able to access all the read URL that has the get method. Now let's stop here so let's disable cross-referencing. And since we're using this an endpoint, we don't want any kind of form. So let's disable the form. Let's see what happens when we try this out. So a summary of this is I've created two users. I've created two roles, admin and user, and two users, read and client. And I've created an instruction on how to use my roles and user. So when a particular user has been authenticated, it also has to be authorized. So if this user is authenticated, for example, this client user is authenticated, but it tries to access this, it should fail because it doesn't have that role. You can see these things are appearing more than once. So one way to clean up your code is to create static final string and say user role, for example, make this user. Private static final string admin role. Admin. And I can replace this with admin role, user role. Do the same here. The same here. So I'm going to run this application again. Let's see what happens here. So the application has started. Let's go test this. I'll run this. And we expect everything to fail. Now let's go to create. Saved. Let's verify. Now you can see that it didn't save, but in here it says it's saved. Now you need to be careful when working with security. Your testing might seem like it's working, but you can see now that it didn't work. Yeah. You can see that these things are even two different stuff. We expect things to fail, things that don't have, things that have the wrong username and password. But for clarity, let's try to test with this. So this is get all with this old password. It says unauthorized. That's with this old password. So I'm going to try it with client and 54321. It says internal server error. Now let's go and check the payroll. It says there is no password encoder marked for ID null. I'm trying to rebuild all the possible errors that you might get when you start implementing security. So what this means is, when dealing with security, you shouldn't be using plain text as passwords. there should be a password encoder for your password. But if you decide not to use a password encoder, Spring Security says you need to have this prefix to your passwords. So this is a prefix according to Spring Boot specification that says you're not using any password encoder. So if I run this again, let's see what happens. I'm going to call that particular method again. It goes in. Now I can get it with this and that. So let's try to call the post that has create. Now remember, we said that this guy is a recognizable user. That means he can be authenticated. Let's see, is he authorized to create, to send this to the database? Unless it happens, let's go back and see. Oh, it's there. So why didn't it follow the specification? Let's see. It means that this particular stamp matching is not correct. You have to be careful about the kind of pattern you use in matching your URLs. Let's try to change this to admin row. I'm going to refresh this. I'm going to call the get all again. No, read. I actually did not map this. So I'm going to call the read. Now pass this. And this security is client. Okay. Now, these are the kind of issues you can get to have when you're implementing security. Using the basic authentication, let's refresh our recollection. It says here, it's not a very secure authentication mechanism. So sometimes things might slip through the crack, like you see this happening now. Two things, either this is not working or the session that was authenticated for this particular Postman client is still there and authorizing for any client that comes in. Let me try weird. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Same thing. So this is the problem you might face. And one of the ways to do that is to close the client and open it again. However, you can test using this. We now have a post here. Let me look at this. This is the race post data. So let's see. Let's add. Right. Now let me test this here. But I'll stop this and start again. There's a problem with my test case. I don't know why this thing keeps changing. Why? Okay, I think it's because of the I think it's in the controller. Now the controller creates a new one. Okay, let's go there. Yeah, it's still not getting in here. Am I looking at the same thing? Oh, okay. Yeah, it's getting deleted. Yeah, it's getting deleted. So let me ignore this. Let's get all. One moment while I try to fix this. So I'm going to call this again. And before that, I need to create it. Is it? Okay, so let me test this again from here and see. Still working. I'm going to close this. Open it again. In the meantime, let's test from here. So it created that and changed it to extra. Now, the security has so many cache and hurdles that you need to pass through. The concept remains the same. to create that. Now the idea is this should be unauthorized. This should be forbidden to create, but it seems not to be catching the URL. Okay, let me do. Oh, okay. I'm saying this is for user role, and this is for admin. Okay, I think I'm not getting something right here because this shouldn't be working. This is yes, this is exactly what I'm looking for. So now you see that for the client, like I said in here, I have in my configuration file, I have two roles, user role and admin role. And the client has the user role. So, and I'm saying here that only the user role can access this particular type of URL. So you can read and get all, but only the admin can create. So when I send a request with the right username and password, it comes back with forbidden because this particular guy shouldn't have access to this type of URL. Now, if you look at this, this ant matcher is a placeholder. This asterisk is a placeholder, meaning that anything can be in here, but it has to follow this pattern. Payroll / whatever / create must only be accessible by the admin. If you run into problems like I did, I think you have to just close your session for both the app, for both this and this. Then you see it's forbidden. But when I change this to the right thing, then I'm able to create. Let me go back. Now with the wrong password in this case, It says unauthorized. Now, unauthorized is with the wrong password. There are two steps. You have to be authenticated, verified before you're authorized. Now, unauthorized is the first one. Now, when you pass in the right password, it tells you forbidden. You're authorized, but that means you're authenticated according to Postman, but you're not authorized. The first one is an authentication error, and the second is authorization error. So that explains whatever we talked about here about authorization, authentication, and authorization. Now, the next thing I want to go into quickly before the time runs up is if you decide to use a password encoder, this is one way to do that. You have to inject as a bin whatever password encoder you want to use. So we're going to use bcrypt here. Many of them you can, but I think this one is one of the frequently used. So we're going to inject this as a bin. What's the error now? Oh, return. Sorry. Return. Then in here, you have to use encoder.encode like that to encode your password. And hopefully when I run this again, there won't be any error with the password. So I've shown to use without encoding and with encoding. Now this is the basic implementation of basic authorization and authentication using Spring Boot. This is how to configure users and roles. All this is describing a security RAM, users and roles, and this is how to specify what particular URL a particular role can access. Now remember, it says a role. For the role, it doesn't need to verify a particular user. It just needs to know that you have the right key. If you remember in what we talked about here, a role can be compared to a key. Many people can have the same copy. The log doesn't care who you are, it just cares that you have the right key. So we're not trying to do any form of authentication here. We're not verifying the user, we're just verifying that you have the right key to access this log. The right key to access this log. You can have a series of logs for one key. You can have one key. And this is how you attach a role to a user using these roles. So do we have any questions? For the test case, this is how you have to run the test case. You need to have your test REST template, the URL, and then you use the basic authentication in what you're doing, whatever you're doing. Basic authentication is there. You can also enforce that only admin can delete stuff. And the way you do that is you come in here, you roll, whatever, delete. Now this must follow the case of all your endpoint exposure. So arrow, whatever, delete. Now it has ID, so you need to also specify that. ID can be whatever. Works. Now we are going to only implement this basic authentication for the purpose of this course. Any questions? No questions? Okay, so for my announcement, I think we have another one-on-one consultation today at 3:30. You can come into the room that says consultation waiting room, and we can start from there. If you have any issues to discuss about, you come in. If the room is all silent, please just raise your hand because I may be in the room but not on that tab. So you have to raise your hand so that it makes a notification that I can come in there. Questions? Questions? Yes, Mr. King.
Hi, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Is the last assignment
Sorry?
for the term? Is security the last topic for this assignment?
Yes, it is the last topic.
So is this the last class also?
No, it's not. We have so many things to talk about.
Oh, so we have class.
Yeah, we have class next week, normal classes. You have a deliverable based on this particular security that I've just done. So you need to implement security on. You need to decide your security policy, and then implement security on whatever you have to do on your application. Now, note that you may not necessarily, you shouldn't actually necessarily follow my stuff. This is just to explain things to you. Based on your application, you should decide. For example, race, reading a particular race should be open to everyone. Updating should not be open. Getting all should be open to everyone. Deleting should not be open. Creating should not be open. So it depends on whatever you're doing. So that is your next deliverable. However, let's explain this test case that has refused to work. Now it's for some reason it's working. So you can see that I am sending the client, and I'm using that to create. And it tells me here that when I try to output the response says 403, meaning that I'm not authorized. So you need to be conversant with the error code. So one way to test your endpoint is you can actually throw you can check the error code. For example, instead of asserting that the array's ID is equal in this case, I'm trying to test for security. I shouldn't be asserting this. Instead, I should assert. I'm expecting HTTP status dot forbidden or something. Where is it? So I'm expecting that, and what is coming back from mine is post dot get status code. So in this case, it's going to fail. Sorry, it's going to pass because this is forbidden. If I pass the right URL, the right username and password, I should be expecting success or whatever. True. Where's that thing? It's 200. Accepted is 1. Accepted is 201 or something. Sorry, created is 201. Status.ok is what I'm looking for. This is 200. So if I run this in this case, it's going to fail because this particular user doesn't have that right. I don't know what is wrong with me today. Run this. So you see my create fails because I'm expecting 200, but I got forbidden, and forbidden is actually what I need to get because this guy is forbidden according to my security policy. Yeah. So I hope this is clear enough. So the steps you need to take as a summary is you need to include this, and you just include this without this class and any configuration here, it generates a password for you. But when you come and override the generated user and password, it uses this. But as an extra leg, if you don't want to use this, if you want to have more than one user and attach roles to them, you have to comment this out so that you don't confuse Spring Boot. You have to comment this out, and then you create a class. And in that class, you must make it a configuration class, enable web security, and then you extend this web security configure adapter, and then you override the configure method that takes the authentication manager builder and the configure method that takes HTTP. And then you use the basic in here to authorize or request if you want to based on your policy, and then you dictate the kind of URL a particular role that has been defined in here and attached to a user can use. And you test it using your test case by including this, the username and password. And that's as simple as that. You would run into errors if you if your client like this saves a particular session that has been authenticated or forbidden, for example. So just close that session and start a new one. Any questions? So your deliverable will be, as a group, talk about the security policies, and you'll be implementing something that would look like this. You define your roles, and then define whatever you need to define in here, and use a password encoder, just the way I've done it in here. So whatever role that you define, whatever user that you define should all be clearly specified in here, and the way that particular user or that particular role can access a particular endpoint should be declared in here. So the group lead is responsible for creating the basic of all roles that any other person should use. For example, in this case, the group lead can create this class, and this method with nothing in it, or for in case you don't create errors for others, then you have to implement the basic role and user. And the basic role is the role that can do the list of all stuff in your application. Like the user role can do the list of all. That means read, and read all, read one and read all. So when you create the basic, whoever is in charge of a particular entity like row, for example, as like race in this case, so let's say I'm in charge of race. I know that it's the admin that should have access to this endpoint to create and update and delete. Then I should implement that in here. Now, if you create one admin, make sure to reuse it. It's going to be strange if you have stuff like this. Admin 2. You call it admin 2. It's going to be strange. So what I'm saying is once one person creates an admin role, it can be reused in any, like here, it can be reused here in race. It can also be reused here. An admin can create and update and delete. It can also be reused here. So whoever is in charge of each of these entities would go and verify in the configure method if that particular URL has been matched. Then you write a test case to verify. I hope that's clear. Now, thank you for your time. If there are no contribution or questions, then that's all for today. I'll stop recording now.